Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this World Affairs Council of Orange County session with General John Allen and with Dr. Darrell West, both from the Brookings Institution, who will be talking about their new book, Turning Point, Policymaking in the Era of Artificial Intelligence. And I'm Dr. Richard Downey. I'm the chair of the programs committee here at the World Affairs Council of Orange County, and it's a real pleasure to have all of you with us, as well as our distinguished speakers. We welcome you to be part of the dialogue here with us, and you can do that by going down to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or at the chat box and asking a question. And you can do that anytime throughout the session, but we'll wait until the question and answer portion before we ask General Allen and Director West to actually address your questions. But we're also very fortunate to have with us today our moderator, Michael Sellitto, who will be introducing our speakers and also moderating the session with the question and answers. Michael is currently at the Center for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence at Stanford University. And he's also a former director of cyber policy at the White House during the period from 2015 to 2018. Before that, he was on the National Security Council staff there as a director. Before that, he was at the Department of State as a special assistant to the Deputy Secretaries of State, as well as to the Coordinator for Counterterrorism. He's also a Presidential Management Fellow at the National Counterterrorism Center. So we are truly delighted and fortunate to have Michael with us to serve as moderator. So without any further ado, Michael, would you please introduce our very distinguished speakers?
Great, thanks, Dr. Downey, for the kind introduction. It's really great to be here as a former foreign policy and national security practitioner, myself, and still a relatively new transplant out to the West Coast. I really appreciate the work done by the World Affairs Council to expose citizens around the country to, critical issues in national security, foreign affairs, international affairs. These kinds of events happen 10 times a day when you're in Washington, but are much sort of harder to find out here on the West Coast. And so I think this is really important work, and thank you for that. And thank you for inviting me to participate today. So we're here to discuss the new book, Turning Point, Policymaking in the Era of Artificial Intelligence, written by Dr. Darrell West and General John Allen. Dr. West is Vice President and Director of Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, where he also holds the Douglas Dillon Chair. His research focuses on artificial intelligence, robotics, and the future of work. Prior to Brookings, Dr. West was the John Hazen White Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at Brown University, and he also holds a PhD in Political Science from Indiana University. General John Allen has served as president of the Brookings Institution since 2017. He's a retired U.S. Marine Corps general and former commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force and U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Following his retirement from the Marine Corps, he also served as Special Presidential Envoy to the Global Coalition to Counter ISIL, a position which was based in the State Department, where I had the pleasure of working alongside the general. General Allen also attended the U.S. Naval Academy, and he holds master's degrees in security studies and intelligence from Georgetown, the Defense Intelligence College, and the National Defense University. So I want to start off with kind of a general question here. Turning Point really covers a lot of ground in the book, explaining the basics of artificial intelligence, how it can be applied in various areas. It addresses both the opportunities to harness the technology, as well as some of the risks that it poses. And perhaps most importantly, it makes a number of recommendations for AI ethics and governance. And Dr. West and General Allen, perhaps we could start with a little bit of background about the book. Why did you write it? What were some of the key takeaways that you found when you were doing research in writing the book? Maybe you could start off with sharing a few thoughts just to sort of set the tone. You are on mute, Dr. West.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Michael. We appreciate your hosting of this event, and it's great to be with the World Affairs Council of Orange County. So John and I wrote this book because we think AI is the transformative technology of our time. As Michael noted, it's being deployed in many different sectors, from healthcare and education to transportation, e-commerce, and national defense. So in the book, we present in-depth case studies of AI in each of those areas. So we look at how it's being used, what the opportunities are, and then also what are the risks that are being generated by AI. We also take a deep dive into AI and national defense, as well as AI and the geopolitical aspects of AI in regard to China, Russia, Europe, and many other places around the world. So the book combines both a US domestic and an international focus, which I think is a novel combination. We chose the title of Turning Point because we argue in the book that we are at a major inflection point in which the world could head either towards utopia or dystopia. And the crucial variable in determining which of those futures we hold actually is public policy. We think that how government reacts, what the nature of the laws, the policies, and the regulations are, can make a big difference. And so, as Michael suggested in the book, we do present a detailed policy blueprint. We talk about the question of who should decide basic governance questions. We present ethical guidelines for the responsible use of AI. And we argue that if we take appropriate actions, we're actually very optimistic about the future. However, if we don't do certain things, we could easily see both the United States and much of the rest of the world go off the rails pretty quickly. So that's just kind of a quick overview of what we do in the book.
Michael, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry, I had a technical challenge there where I wasn't able to unmute myself. Okay, we're back. Thanks, Dr. West, for that overview of the book. You know, much of the book really describes how AI could transform some of the industries and sectors that are really fundamental to our societies and the way we live. Education, healthcare, transportation, even e-commerce, which I think if it wasn't a major aspect of your life before the pandemic, it probably is now. What are some of the ways that you see AI either being applied in those sectors already, or some examples of where you see there being some real transformative impact of AI's use? And I want to start off with some of maybe the positive and beneficial sides of the technology, and then we'll get into some more of the conversation about addressing some of the risks.
Well, maybe I can give a couple of examples, and then if somebody can unmute John, he will be able to provide some additional information as well. So certainly on the positive side, there are lots of really important AI initiatives taking place in the area of sustainability. There's lots of ways in which AI is helping in terms of building construction and building management, in terms of energy efficiency and promoting a green energy kind of agenda. In Chicago, I know Chicago and many other cities are implementing various types of sensors that measure noise levels, gunshots, and other types of things. And then they're able to analyze that information and figure out how to deploy resources. There are widespread applications in the finance area. Many financial institutions have moved to AI in terms of loan approval and mortgage applications. In the e-commerce area, you may notice when you're shopping online, you're looking at certain products, and then you'll get a notice say, hey, you might be interested in these following other items. That is basically an AI application that has looked both at the products you have purchased as well as items you may have looked at but not purchased, and it then makes recommendations. And some sites claim that up to a third of their sales now are coming from these AI-based recommendations. So it's a sign that the AI is getting good when it knows what you want before you know what you want.
Michael, let me come in, please. I couldn't get unmuted for the first question. One of the points that we try to make in the book is that we're not going to tell you how to write code. We're not going to offer code. We're not going to explain how to bend metal. But one of the things that has been clear in the recent past has been that technology often races well ahead of the whole process of policy development. And we can't afford for that to occur in the environment where artificial intelligence is becoming so pervasive across all sectors of humanity. And so this book would propose that in many respects, these technologies, AI, supercomputing, big data analytics, and other emerging technologies, many of these technologies are in fact values neutral. But we have in the West, or more broadly, the community of democracies, we have an obligation as these technologies become more pervasive in day-to-day life for us to grapple much more quickly with the policy implications for the application of these technologies than we have been able to stand in previous technologies. So this is really an important moment. Darrell called it a turning point. It is. It's a turning point. It's an inflection point. And what we propose in the book is not about code or bending metal. What we propose is that we as a community of democracies have to come to grips with how these technologies can be wielded in the public sector, in the human sector, and to do it to the maximum extent we can for the public good and for the good of humanity. And I like to do this when we have this conversation. We dedicated the book, and I'll just read the dedication. This book is dedicated to our youth, into whose hand we place the full potential of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. It is our most fervent prayer that they are guided by the light of good in wielding these technologies for the benefit of all humanity. Now, that's our dedication and that's our hope, but we already are seeing in many places around the world and in the private sector that these technologies are not being wielded for the greater good of humanity. And we've got to get a handle on that. And I think that's very important. And let me just come back to introductory remarks. I really want to commend the World Affairs Council. It is an enormously important gathering opportunity, and the community that comes together in the context of the World Affairs Council is far better served for coming together and helping our society at this particularly difficult moment. And I want to thank Dr. Downey and Nassim Kadir, but also Michael, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. I've been watching you from a distance, but also watching you up close. The Human Assistant or Human AI at Stanford is a great organization, and you're so well qualified to do this tonight. In fact, if Darrell and I got off the net right now, you could simply interview yourself, and it would be a very entertaining evening. So it's great to be with you and to see you again. And I apologize, I couldn't get off mute for the first question, so I'll listen up now.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for those kind remarks and giving us some more overview of the book and what you're trying to accomplish. I wanted to sort of jump in and one area that you mentioned that both of your remarks sort of touched on, which is the pervasiveness of the technology and how it's really going to affect so much of human life. And one of the areas that we tend to think of sort of at the top is in the future of work and how jobs are going to change over time. Some work done by Mike Webb, who was a Stanford PhD student at the time and whose work has been covered extensively by Brookings in a report last year, really found that the impact of AI on jobs was going to be very different than in previous rounds of automation. In previous rounds of automation, it was really about manufacturing and doing things that sort of were very repetitive in nature. And what Mike's research finds is that AI is really going after the higher level aspects of jobs around data analytics and the things that are typically more of in the white collar workers. And so I'm wondering, what kind of changes do you see coming in terms of labor markets, the future of work, and how do we prepare society for these changes? Because now it's really a different category of worker who's potentially in the crosshairs of the technology, not sort of the ones that have been feeling it, since, for the last few decades anyway, in more traditional automation.
I think that's a great question, and I think you're absolutely right that the ramifications both of AI and technology in general for the workforce is enormous. And there's certain sectors where we already are seeing job losses in terms of retail, finance, but it's not just kind of the low-skilled jobs that are at risk, like even radiologists. Like there's really good AI now that can diagnose X-rays and CAT scans. So it's something that is going to have broad ramifications for the workforce as a whole. But we also know technology will create some jobs. But the problem is going to be what we call the mismatch hypothesis, that people are not necessarily going to have the skills for some of those new jobs that are being created. So from my standpoint, I think we need to think seriously about renegotiating our social contract with one another. And again, this is kind of the public policy angle that we bring in this book in general, that not all tech problems have to be solved by technology, that there are policy solutions that can help workers adapt. So, as jobs are lost, we need to invest more in workforce development. We certainly need to kind of rethink our social insurance policies to emphasize benefit portability. There's probably going to be an increase in what we call job churn, meaning people moving from company to company and sector to sector. I've been fortunate in my adult life. I've had two jobs, basically. I taught at Brown University and then now work at Brookings. When I talk to young people, I tell them that is not going to be their experience. They're going to work for 6, 7, 8, or 9 different companies. And so being able to maintain your benefits, healthcare benefits, disability insurance, and retirement benefits as you're moving from company to company is going to be very important. And then the last thing I'll mention is just the notion of lifelong learning. Our current educational model basically kind of assumes people are investing in education up through about age 25, and then that's all you need. We're clearly in an era where people are going to have to upskill and reskill themselves at age 30, 40, 50, and 60. So basically, it's going to place a premium on adult education, lifelong learning, people taking online courses, working in certificate programs and so on, but kind of figuring out that workforce angle is going to be a critical part of moving forward.
And let me come in behind that. Darrell gave you a terrific answer, but I think also very important is where the conversation begins. And the conversation has got to begin with how we basically educate our youth. We're staring at the horizon of a massive revolution, a digital horizon, if you will, for a massive revolution within our societies. And we've got to prepare our curricula in our schools, our high schools, have got to prepare our students for as much resilience as possible, to prepare them for the digital environment in which they'll have to work. So Darrell's exactly right. Lifelong learning is very important, and we have to be prepared to adjust to technologies as we go on. But we have an obligation to prepare our students in the classroom, in secondary schools, to take that journey in order for them to be ready for the changes that will come to the workforce, but also the changes that'll be demanded of the worker. And here's an important point. What's happened here with respect to COVID is in ways where many of us understood, but I think now more broadly the society has been confronted with, is the exposure of so much of our society, the vulnerable populations, our Black and brown populations that have already been underserved by the educational experience that they've had. Now that our children have been driven out of the classrooms, so many of the students in general in the United States simply disappeared from the educational experience. And in numbers far out of proportion to the size of the portion of the population, our vulnerable elements of our population disappeared in huge numbers from the experience. So as we think about recovering from COVID, here is our opportunity to invest in education, to invest in broadband access, and to prepare these youngsters as they come back into the classroom for the kinds of digitally oriented education at the secondary level that prepares them for the lifelong learning for a digital environment. Here is the chance. And the other piece of this is, as well as we begin to try to build back businesses at the grassroots level, investments in Black and brown startups in technology also empowers that segment of our population to embrace the inevitably approaching technological revolution that we're all going to experience. But what we can't afford as a nation in terms of productiveness and ultimately the future of the country is for such a large segment of our population to be disenfranchised from the education and from the technical environment within which we can be a far greater country if we have all of our community involved in this. So Darrell hit it right on the head. But we've got to start the conversation earlier, and the conversation has to be emanating out of the classroom as well to prepare the platform in our students' minds for the digital environment that is inevitably coming. And we have an obligation as a nation, we have an obligation as a people to do all we can for our minority populations and those who are vulnerable and disadvantaged, our tribal populations, et cetera, to set them up for success as well, so the digital environment doesn't sprint right past them the way other innovations have done in the past. That's another point that we make in the book.
Yeah, I really couldn't have said it any better. I think you're completely right about the disparate impact that COVID is having on the educational opportunities of different communities within the United States. It's really quite striking, when you bring into relief that some people don't even have access to any broadband, let alone reliable broadband to do work. And you hear about the ordeals they have to go through just to get access to the internet in order to, try to be good students. And so I think you're completely right that if we don't really solve that problem, we're going to continue to have classes of people that really just can't keep up with those that already have more advantages. And that's just going to double down on the existing disparities within society.
Michael, let me come in very quickly behind this. There is a great young PhD who runs for Darrell something called the Center for Technology Innovation, and her name is Nicole Turner-Lee. And she has done a great deal of work on something that I know you're aware of and we're all aware of, and it's called the digital divide. And there is a huge digital divide in our country. And that digital divide is not closing. In fact, it's getting greater, which means a huge segment of the population is going to be on the reverse side, the backside of a digital divide that empowers a huge segment of the population while leaving others unempowered and unenfranchised to take advantage of the digital environment as it comes forward. And so I think we've to be very, very conscious of the digital divide in all of its manifestations. And as a people and as a country, systematically address that to empower as much of the population going forward. And the COVID recovery is the perfect moment for us to do that.
So that's a really good point to zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit more at the societal level. So, one of the things that we've seen with technology is that so far it's really tended to be a force for concentrating wealth, right? We see, massive companies, in the, hundreds of billions or $1 trillion, market cap. And it's really sort of concentrated wealth in a certain way. And there's a lot of concern that artificial intelligence is going to continue that trend and continue the concentration of wealth and power. Is that something that you're concerned about? And do you have some recommendations or suggestions for what we might be able to do to ensure that the benefits of the technology really are shared and there's a shared prosperity that's coming out of these technological developments?
I mean, I certainly worry about the income inequality that already existed, but I think you're right. Technology is accentuating that and making it far worse. We have some colleagues in our Metro Studies program that also have pointed out the great geographic disparities that we're seeing right now. They did an analysis both after the 2016 election and then updated it after 2020 and found only about 15% of American counties are now generating 70% of the GDP. What that basically means is much of the economic activity in America is on the West Coast, the East Coast, and then a few metropolitan areas in between. And this is a huge problem. This fuels kind of the populist politics that we're seeing. People sense that, the system is rigged against them. They're not doing well. We've seen the overtime numbers in terms of a lack of income growth for the middle class and the working class over the last 30 years. I mean, there are just lots of problems that flow from that. So we do place a lot of emphasis in the book on thinking about possible recommendations. So there are place-based recommendations, like how you build urban economies for those areas that currently are being left behind, how you make changes in education so that people can share in the benefits of the technology revolution, the workforce development point that I mentioned earlier, those people who are losing jobs, making sure they don't become part of the permanent underclass. So there's a whole host of things that we need to be thinking about on many different fronts.
And to come in again behind Darrell, and I find myself coming in behind Darrell all the time because he's got such great thoughts on these issues. I think broadband access is really the key to this. It becomes the platform from which almost all things associated with education and entrepreneurship and business opportunities can take root across the country. I saw a flash on my chat a moment ago. Should broadband be considered a human right? I think it ought to be. It simply can't be a right of those who are, as Darrell said, on the coasts, in that few numbers of counties that produce 70% of the American GDP. Well, the other side of that same coin is how much of America is producing 30% of the GDP, and how much of that is a self-limitation by virtue of access to technology and broadband. It ought to be a human right wherever you are. But in this country, the fact that this country is so technologically advanced and so wealthy, and the fact that it is not a human right and not universally accessible across this country is something that has to be changed. And there needs to be investment to do that. And here's the private sector. Here's where the private sector, which is, I think, really seized with many of these issues, actually, through corporate social responsibility and their intent to empower segments of our population that are vulnerable. Here's where the private sector, in partnership with the federal government, a federal government that's really committed to dealing with issues of equity and inequality, which I think the next one will be, here's an opportunity that we've not seen come together in a very long time. And here's the opportunity to go after this broadband issue, upon which then education can change, lifelong learning, the fate of the worker, and work in general will ultimately evolve in ways that empower all of the population, and not just 15% of them that live in the counties that are on the coasts.
So mindful of the time here, and I want to get through a few other topics, I'd like to turn to the topic of surveillance. Artificial intelligence is particularly good at performing tasks at a scale and with a kind of persistence that humans really can't match, which means it's very well suited for tasks like surveillance, monitoring video cameras, for instance, which could be for good purposes. And in California, we've been working on some opportunities to use AI to monitor video cameras to detect wildfires early on. A huge problem for the state, of course. But it could also be used for tracking people. And there was an article in the Washington Post yesterday that reported on some leaked documents from the Chinese telecom Huawei that alleged that the company had tested a facial recognition system that sought to identify people of Uyghur ethnicity, a minority group that's really been the subject of persecution in China. And according to the article, the system was designed to monitor CCTV footage and send out Uyghur alerts or Uyghur alarms to the police forces if Uyghur individuals were detected in certain areas. And it's kind of tough to imagine, what good could come from a system like that. And, more broadly, privacy and human rights advocates are worried that the development of these technologies, even half a world away, really starts to set a tone and norms for what's acceptable use of the technology, that normalizes it, that encourages other authoritarian governments to adopt those practices and so on. And so I guess, maybe setting aside the specifics of this individual case, I'm wondering more broadly, what role do you see for liberal democracies and the various stakeholders within them, government, industry, civil society, to try to put some guardrails on the technology and really do some take some actions to ensure that the technology supports and upholds human rights, and that companies are not developing and selling technologies that really only have some kind of harm in mind. How do we help prevent people from this misuse?
Well, I know that you all are working on this where you're located, Michael, but I'll come in behind it and Darrell can follow up. China has become the greatest surveillance society on the planet. And for a whole variety of reasons. First, their indigenous computing capability gives them the capacity to do that. So they're not obligated to account for their computing to anyone other than themselves. Plus, their sophistication in artificial intelligence has given them algorithms, the capacity to develop algorithms that gives China, between the capacity for computing and the algorithms and the numbers of people in the population that they surveil, the three things you need in order for artificial intelligence to work: big data, algorithms, and supercomputing. They've got it all. And not surprisingly, it's an authoritarian regime. And other authoritarian regimes and other illiberal regimes, in order for them to remain where they are, which is in power and in governance, they can't be that way. They can't remain that way without the capacity to surveil their populations for the purposes of, in the end, suppressing their population. And that's what you're seeing. So this goes to the point that we made at the very beginning, which is that we propose in the book that artificial intelligence, through intelligent application of policy at the front end of the era of artificial intelligence, is the way we do what you're talking about, Michael, which is protect our population from technology, not subject our population to technology. I mean, I believe this very strongly. It's a deeply held feeling of my own, because I've dealt with these oppressive societies before, and left to themselves, they will use these technologies. We have a higher obligation in the West and in the democracies, in the community of democracies, first and foremost, to respect and to treasure and celebrate human rights, the rule of law, etc. And when you hear about democracies coming together to talk about artificial intelligence, I'm really inspired in many respects that the first conversation is about how do we come together to create behaviors for the employment of these technologies on behalf of our populations that first and foremost respect their human rights, their privacy, and the rule of law. And so we're having conversations in a transatlantic sense between the United States and Europe, and in particular with the EU, on this very issue. And before we even talk about innovation and moving into application, et cetera, and scaling these kinds of technologies, the first part of the conversation, I think everyone would be very happy to hear, was all about what we share in terms of our shared values. So this is something that's really important, Michael, and you raise this point. It is going to be around this matter, the values associated with the derivation and the application of these technologies, which in many respects are going to define the 21st century. And I'm really encouraged by the Biden administration, as it's coming in, that they're talking about something called a democracy summit, or a summit of democracies, where the West is often the term that we use, and I've used it tonight, and I almost bit my tongue off saying it. The West is an exclusive term. There are really sophisticated democracies in East Asia that are technologically sophisticated. They're committed to human rights and the rule of law. They're democratic societies. They have capitalist economies. And the Biden administration's intent is to bring together the community of democracies to pool our values in a way that gives us the capacity for a basis to do other things. Well, one of those other things is, how do we together move forward with advanced technologies that serve our publics rather than to subject our publics? And I think that's a really powerful moment. This is, as Darrell said, this is a turning point. And we can leave it to the authoritarians to use these technologies to suppress their people. And by the way, the authoritarians are also active in development in the developing world. And they sell these packages of surveillance capabilities to include facial recognition and other capabilities into the developing world. And once those systems are in place, it's hard for the West, if you will, or the community of democracy to root them out. So you've hit on the point that may well define geopolitics in the 21st century.
So I think that's a nice segue to discuss ethics and governance a little bit more broadly. The book devotes basically 2 chapters, ethical safeguards, and then sort of a roadmap for governance. We seem to see daily that there's new examples of some sort of unintended harm or consequence with the implementation of AI technologies. And in many cases, in hindsight, it sort of looks like something that probably should have been predictable if you had, really been thoughtful in the design and development stage. So what are some of the recommendations that you make in the book in order to avoid some of these pitfalls going forward?
I can just throw out a couple of ideas that we emphasize. And you're right, we do take ethics very seriously. It's important to develop responsible uses of AI. So we have one whole chapter on how to build responsible AI and to incorporate ethics in the process. And part of it is companies need to hire ethicists. It's not just about the technology. They need to think about the sociological consequences as well as the ethical considerations. They need to develop AI review processes in the same way that universities have human subjects committees to kind of review research and what the possible ramifications are on people. Companies should have internal processes that look at product design early in the process to decide what the possible negative ramifications are and how are they going to mitigate them. What we do now is basically companies innovate, they sell their products, they put them out in the world, problems start developing, and then we rush to try and figure out how to deal with the problem that is already there. If we can become more proactive as opposed to reactive, that would make a big difference. On the policy side, we have a number of different ideas. I'll just hit one of them. We propose the creation of what we call AI impact statements, kind of modeled after the environmental impact statements of 50 years ago, where developers on large-scale projects that were publicly funded had to develop an impact statement, kind of looking at the environmental consequences of their development and how they would mitigate them. For large-scale publicly funded AI projects, we think it would be useful for there to be AI impact statements, kind of looking at the possible negative ramifications, how it affects people. It could be privacy, security, human safety, or other types of considerations, and how we're going to mitigate them so that we can think about those problems in advance.
Yeah, I really want to echo that suggestion of AI review boards. At Stanford, my institute really is involved in putting out a lot of research grants, and we felt that since we're a funding organization, we really have a responsibility to not fund research where the potential harm outweighs the potential benefit. So we've been piloting something we're calling an ethics review board, which is an analog to the institutional review board. So the IRB looks at what's the impact on the human subjects of research. The ethical review board looks at what's the impact of the research on the broader society. So I think we're coming up with a model here. We've been piloting it and having some interesting results, which I'm hoping we'll be able to share sometime early in the new year that maybe could be a model for others to follow. I'm really mindful of the time here and the desire to get some audience questions in. So I'm going to pivot past a few other topics here. And I just wanted to touch a little bit on sort of the military aspects of the use of AI, especially since it was a significant portion of the book. And of course, we're fortunate to have General Allen here. So, there's a lot of concern expressed, especially in Silicon Valley, about the dual use nature of the technology and with private companies working with the Defense Department and so on. And I think in the popular imagination, whenever we talk about DoD and AI, people start to think about the Terminator and killer robots. But what we've seen is that a lot of course, what the Department of Defense does is pretty mundane, like moving things around the world. And there's that famous saying that logistics wins wars, right? And so, General Allen, you talk in the book about some of the early applications of AI and DoD on topics like predictive maintenance. Can you tell us a little bit more about these kinds of uses of AI within DoD and give us some examples of where it's being used?
Well, you're exactly right. The issues associated with the conversation very quickly ends up with us sort of recounting the Terminator movies. And that then sort of blanks out all credible conversation thereafter. Look, AI is applied not infrequently across the department now. And before even we talk about the employment of a single weapon system, if you call the whole issue of applying the weapons on one side of the firewall, the other side of the firewall is the utilitarian use of artificial intelligence, and it's for predictive maintenance, for example, with smart systems that have artificial intelligence associated with their dynamic systems, for example, that have the capacity to be constantly self-diagnosing themselves to detect anomalies in their operations at the very earliest moment in the dynamic system where the anomaly is occurring. So where before, if I went to sea, for example, on a ship, and we had a critical failure of, say, a generator on board the ship, a generator today with artificial intelligence monitoring it will detect the anomaly in the dynamic systems on that generator far earlier than before. And it then signals the fact that maintenance will be needed almost immediately to prevent a catastrophic failure of a particular system. This is characteristic through almost anything that we do in the department where we have dynamic systems, whether they're generators or whether they're engines or whether they are transportation systems, where we have the capacity now through artificial intelligence and other systems to monitor the smooth operation of a particular system to ensure that we are out ahead of it. That preventive maintenance is going to save us, well, billions of dollars in maintenance. Because when you have a highly sophisticated system that has a catastrophic failure, the recovery of that system plus the operational downtime of that organization because that system has failed can be quite expensive in all kinds of ways. So there is the employment of these systems for maintenance, supply, system, inventories, which give us the capacity to be far more efficient and efficient in the use of the systems, but also efficient in how we spend the money for repairs and spare parts and that sort of thing. Then you find that as we move forward in time, we will see that artificially intelligent intelligence systems have the capacity for really sophisticated capacity for intelligence analysis. And where before we may have needed a large number of humans to be involved in the intelligence analysis, we'll find that, as Darrell and you, I think, have said, we can sift through huge amounts of information using AI algorithms to give us indicators far earlier in that process than we would otherwise been able to do in humans or in human terms. And then we have the capacity for artificially intelligent support to decisions that commanders may have to make. So you'll be able to realize intelligence information more quickly. That will feed into the capacity for artificial intelligence to assist in decision making more quickly. And the chapter spends a lot of time on this, but conflict is really a time competitive process. And all other things being equal, the side that can decide more quickly can communicate that decision in whatever form it might be to the subordinate units more quickly and can act more quickly will almost invariably prevail in one form or another. And so what artificial intelligence does is it begins to speed up the process in conflict between the decision and the action. And you'll hear in the chapter a theory of what's called hyperwar, which is warfare because of the presence of artificial intelligence, from the intelligence collection to the actual application of the weapon system, that is aided by artificial intelligence that moves it so quickly that we're going to have to come to grips with the issue about where the human is in the loop in the future. And this goes back to the issue associated with surveillance. We are an ethical people. We will want to have a say in whether an autonomous, artificially intelligent system takes a human life. Because of who we are, we want to have a say in that. Many of our opponents, Michael, as you know, don't care about that. And as the Russians are bombing hospitals in Syria, as the Chinese have got 1 million Uyghurs locked up in the Xinjiang province, we, on the other hand, have got to come to grips, and we haven't done it yet. And it's a major conversation, and I think we should all be happy we're having it. We have got to come to grips with where is the human in the loop in the application of force in an artificially intelligent hyperwar environment. And that's coming, and we're going to have that conversation.
I'm reminded of an anecdote I heard where a number of software engineers were in a room with a number of military commanders, and somebody asked a question, raise your hand if you've had sort of formal ethics training as part of your schooling or your professional education. And at least as the story goes, all of the military commanders raised their hand and none of the software engineers did. And I'm struck by a comment that you made, General Allen, in a private meeting we were both at recently, about how serious the education is for military commanders in the laws of war and international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, right, most prominently, which is really about reducing human suffering in war. And even if my anecdote about the engineers versus the military commanders is an exaggeration, it's fair to say that the Geneva Conventions are not sort of part of the curriculum of most CS departments these days. And so just as kind of a final question before we turn to the audience, are you concerned about or what sort of measures might we put in place to ensure that if AI is going to be used in a case that might have some lethal potential, that the people developing the tools really understand what kind of rights and responsibilities they have to develop something that complies with international law?
Well, the first thing is that American, and more broadly, probably our allied commanders, will never be absolved of their inherent responsibility to first and foremost remain true to the law. And as a commander in combat, I had three obligations. The first was, if I used force to take a human life, there had to be a necessity to do it. When I applied force, I had to be able to successfully discriminate between those upon whom I was going to use that force and those who were innocent. So combatants versus non-combatants. And then the third was to use only enough force to accomplish my objectives. So necessity, discrimination, proportionality. That never changes. And as a theater commander leading the war in Afghanistan, or a rifle company commander, those three same requirements were laid upon me. And so that has to be what we generate, or what we require of our algorithms as well. And this is the difficult conversation, Michael. You've been in it, Darrell's been in it, I've been in it. When we talk about fully autonomous, what we call laws, lethal autonomous weapon systems, fully autonomous systems that does the target acquisition, the target identification, and then the target engagement, there's got to be a human in here somewhere based on who we are as a people and who we are as a nation. Now, when the person is in this loop, the person in the loop, inherently, the person either checks the system before the round is fired, or the system runs automatically and the human intervenes to prevent the round from being fired. That's a human either in the loop or a human on the loop. But our opponents don't have a human anywhere in the loop on that at all. And they're satisfied that if they get the round off before we do, they'll win. So this is really the dilemma that we're facing today. And there could be, and I want to be very careful, I'm not a code writer or a metal bender. There could be an occasion where, in the course of the interaction between our professional military and a seasoned, professionally educated engineer, we can engineer into the algorithm the three requirements of the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law. But I'm skeptical about it now, and I'd have to see it and believe it, and it has to be thoroughly tested. Meanwhile, a commander that releases an autonomous system into the battle space is fully responsible for the destruction or the life that is taken by that system. She is never absolved of that responsibility. And I think that's a really important point.
Well, thanks. This has been a wonderful conversation, but now I want to turn things over to the Vice Chair of Programs at the World Affairs Council of Orange County, Rick Putnam, to ask some of the audience questions.
Michael, thank you for a wonderful moderation. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, excellent. And Director West and General Allen, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. I'm going to just read pretty directly from a couple of questions that we've received from the audience and combine a few of those. One, just on a very practical basis, can you describe for us what impact artificial intelligence has had on the recent pandemic in terms of contribution to advances there. And then as well, a related question was, has AI helped the US in its figuring out of these cyber attacks that have occurred, as we've heard about in the Cuban embassy and elsewhere? And then finally, along this line, any other near-term medical advances that might be foreseen with AI?
Perhaps I can take the COVID question. And there are AI and data analytic applications that have been an enormous help just in terms of developing new drugs, developing new vaccines, because a lot of new drug and vaccine development is based on looking at the scientific literature and trying to come up with new combinations or new approaches that might make a difference on the particular illness. So it turns out that AI and machine learning is actually really good at reading the scientific literature and trying to find some of those new combinations. So AI has been a big help on COVID. Obviously, the data analytics piece has been important. It has been important just in terms of tracking the spread of the disease, identifying the racial disparities that we're seeing, and help us get a handle on where it is, but also where this pandemic may go.
Let me also offer that while I'm careful about predicting any particular outcome in Washington these days, my guess is that we will eventually see something like a COVID commission, which would be like the 9/11 commission. But it's going to be a while because we have to see how this continues to unfold. But my guess will be that one of the questions that the COVID commission will address is, and this isn't about looking in the past, we'll have lots of opportunity to decide what we did right or wrong. This will be about getting us ready for the future. Are we posturing technology in conjunction with a potential future pandemic or a bioterror attack? Are we posturing technology to the maximum extent we can to both detect a potential pandemic as it's breaking out through global surveillance using artificial intelligence in that regard, but also are we posturing the technology to be most helpful as the pandemic begins to develop, to be on the front end, even further on the front end of the development of a vaccine in the manner that Darrell has said. So I think technology has played a role, and technology in the context of preparing us for the next pandemic, and sadly there will be, but there's also the potential of a bioterror attack. Technology, just as it will in warfare, it gives us the capacity to move far more quickly to a solution than ever before.
Thank you. Two final questions, excellent questions. I'll just read them fairly verbatim. And this certainly has been touched on, but perhaps a direct frontal answer to the following. Where do you think is the balance between regulation and the freedom to innovate? You know, how does that actually happen?
At that point, I'll just note that we are experiencing a techlash against the technology sector, kind of a backlash against technology. You can see it in public opinion surveys. We're seeing increased government regulation already. There's antitrust actions that are taking place against Facebook and Google. So I do believe this era of what used to be called permissionless innovation is coming to an end, where we basically delegated the governance choice to private companies. There's going to be a new era of more public engagement, public oversight, and public regulation. Now, as your question suggests, we don't want to go overboard on that, but right now we are so far in the direction of very little regulation that I think there is going to be a movement towards a greater regulation. We're actually already seeing it at the state and local level. And even in this era of divided party control nationally, we may actually start to see either congressional action. We're certainly going to see departmental and agency enforcement under the new Biden administration.
I would certainly favor that view. It's hard to imagine in this divisive, populist, authoritarian time that will come about. And then the last again is, in a somewhat interesting question, is along that line, when ethical decisions have to be made about choices in public policy and economic good, the greater good, et cetera, at some point do do humans need to be out of the loop, and is AI best equipped to make those decisions ultimately?
Well, we are years from convergence, which is general AI. Right now, we have very limited and narrow AI, which in the big scheme of things shouldn't be left unsupervised, in my mind. So for now, we'll have to wrestle with where the human needs to be in the loop in the process, because it is the right thing to do for our people, for our commitment in the context of being consistent with human rights, et cetera. There will be others who don't care. There will be others who will not supervise even the narrowly capable AI, but it is inherent in who we are. Michael is in a program that does nothing but think about the human in the context of artificial intelligence. And I think it's an obligation of ours. If we're going to be true to ourselves as a people, we're going to be true to ourselves as a great democracy, we have to have a human in the loop for now. But at some point, when the sophistication of the algorithms becomes so great that we can trust it, then that's a different conversation. But we are nowhere near that yet.
General Allen and Director West, Michael, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to our board chair, Nora Valenzuela, for closing.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Nora, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. Technical challenge. Thank you so much. We truly appreciate the time and the knowledge that you shared with us. I am personally very grateful for recognizing the digital divide as being a challenge. I'm personally close to that because I actually created a digital equity program for County of Riverside. And we were one of the first counties nationwide that was able to provide over 3,000 computers to families last year before even COVID started it. We had no idea COVID was coming. And if it wasn't because of that, there's no way those families would have had, the families would have computers for the kids to have schooling, and also the homeless veterans that were able to get computers through us so they can even have medical care. So I am immensely grateful that that's becoming important of a discussion for people to recognize that the digital divide will be the most impactful human rights issue in our societies, because and it'll create it more and more and more. And so thank you so much for that. That's wonderful. In terms of other conversations, I am a technologist. I came from computer science background. Darrell and I had a fun conversation in the back end about it. We both are old timers and we use punch cards instead of computers. But I remember one of my professors one time asked me, and AI was very new. It wasn't even in existence. It was just a conversation about, can computers think for themselves? And I'm talking about 39 years ago when I graduated. It wasn't even AI yet. And I asked my professor, I said, well, computers can think for themselves, but human beings have to put the data in. And what if we're not ethical? What if we put the wrong data? Because the computer only recognizes 0 and 1, it's binary. So how are they going to know? I was a kid. I didn't know anything, but I just questioned that because, yes, it's an ethical issue. Right. It is a social ethical issue. So I am so excited. Everything I heard today was just reminiscing all these wonderful things that I think we can all benefit from it. So thank you. I'm immensely grateful for that. I'm also grateful to all of our volunteers, our staff, Colonel Downey, and of course, Rick, that help us in putting the program together. And Nassim, of course, did a wonderful job. So thank you for that. And also all of those guests that we have who are from actually all over the United States today. Believe it or not, we have a lot of guests who are remote, and that's one of the benefit of having a webinar. I'd like to encourage our guests and audience to please do buy the book, Turning Point. They will be getting 15% discount, and we will have that information. I'll have our executive director actually email that information to all the people who registered for the event, so they would know where to get the book and also qualify for the discount. And I'm looking forward to get it myself and read it. we like to invite you to come back in person when we are able to host you in person. So I can, at the end of the event, as I do for all of our guests, buy you a glass of Cabernet and celebrate learning from you and getting to know you. Thank you for the wonderful opportunity. We're immensely grateful. And I'm immensely grateful that science is recognized and is appreciated in the world of politics and policy making. Thank you very much. Wishing everyone a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you next time. Good day.
Thank you. Be safe and be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.